Marin Calloway pressed her father's codebook against her broken ribs and did not make a sound. The cattle wagon hit a rut in the Wyoming road, and the pain came in white and total, and she bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper and held herself perfectly still against the grain sacks in the dark. She was 27 years old. She had 3 cracked ribs, a split lip that had stopped bleeding 2 hours ago, and her husband's name on a marriage certificate she had left burning in the kitchen stove. She was never going back. If this story already has your heart in your throat, stay with us. Every part of Marin and Holt's story is coming, and we want you here for all of it. Subscribe to our channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that wagon. The codebook had belonged to her father for 22 years, and Marin had memorized every page of it before she was 12 years old. It was the one thing she had taken when she ran. Not the silver earrings her mother had left her. Not the photograph of her father standing in front of the telegraph office the day he opened it, squinting into the Laramie sun, with his hand over his eyes and his whole life ahead of him. Just the codebook, because the codebook was the work, and the work was the only thing Devlin Marsh had never been able to take from her. He had taken most everything else. She lay still against the grain sacks and concentrated on breathing in a way that did not move her ribs. 3 days ago, she could breathe without thinking about it. That was before Devlin had come home from the courthouse with a bottle of whiskey and the news that the Railroad Commission had declined his petition and had decided that the blame for this belonged, as it always did, in his telling to her. She did not think about the 3 days between then and now. There was no use in thinking about them. What she thought about instead was forward, the road she was on, the direction the wagon was heading, the weight of the codebook against her side, solid and real, and hers and the key to the telegraph office on the cord around her neck that she had not taken off in 6 days. The wagon stopped. Marin went completely still. She heard the driver's seat creak, heard boots hit the ground, heard the deliberate, unhurried footsteps of someone walking around the outside of the wagon with the patience of a man who was not afraid of what he might find. The canvas at the back lifted. The man holding the lantern was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and dark eyes that were doing something careful and thorough to the situation without doing anything rash about it yet. He held the lantern low. He looked at the grain sacks. He looked at her. He looked at the codebook pressed against her side, and the way her arm was wrapped around her own rib cage, and the split in her lower lip that had crusted over but not healed. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You want to tell me what happened, or do you need a minute first?" His voice was low and even, and there was no performance in it. Marin had spent 14 months learning to hear the difference between a man managing his temper and a man who did not have one to manage. She listened to this one carefully. "I'm fine," she said. "You're holding your ribs like they've got opinions about being moved." "I said I'm fine." He looked at her for another moment. Then he set the lantern on the wagon gate and pulled himself up to sit on the edge of it, not coming in, not crowding her, just settling there with the particular stillness of a man who had decided he had time to wait. "My name's Holt Decker," he said. "I run the Saddleback Ridge Ranch about 18 miles northeast of Casper. You're in my cattle wagon." He paused. "I'm not going to drag you out of it." Marin studied him in the lantern light. She had gotten very good in the past 14 months at sorting men quickly. The ones who smiled too much. The ones who went quiet in the wrong kind of way. The ones whose help always came with a weight attached to it that showed itself later. This one was harder to read. The stillness in him was not the stillness of someone controlling himself. It was the stillness of someone who had simply decided to be still, which was a different thing entirely, and she did not entirely trust that she was reading it correctly, because she had been wrong before about things she was certain of. "Marin Calloway," she said. "Marin." He nodded once like he was putting it somewhere he'd find it again. "Where are you coming from?" "Laramie." "And where are you going?" She looked at him steadily. "Away from Laramie." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite what she expected. Not amusement, not impatience. Something that recognized the answer and accepted it. "Fair enough," he said. "Can I look at your ribs?" "No." "I've got clean cloth and carbolic in my kit. A cracked rib that's not wrapped is going to make the next 50 miles considerably worse than they need to be." He waited. "I'm not asking to be kind, Miss Calloway. I'm asking because you're going to need to breathe properly to think clearly, and from the look of things, you're going to need to think clearly before long." That stopped her. She looked at him. "How do you know I need to think clearly?" Woman running from Laramie at 3 in the morning with a busted lip and her arm around her own ribs doesn't have the luxury of not thinking clearly. He held her gaze. "Whatever you're running from is still behind you. That means you've got some time. Doesn't mean you've got a lot." Marin looked at the codebook in her hands. The leather cover was worn smooth at the corners from her father's hands, from her own hands, from 22 years of use. She thought about Devlin's voice at the kitchen table saying you'll come back when you've had time to think about what you're walking away from, and she thought about the way he had said it without raising his voice with that cold and certain patience that was worse than the shouting. "Your foreman or your hand do this kind of work," she said. "Treating injuries." "My housekeeper does. Vera Hutchins. She was a field nurse in the war." He paused. "She doesn't ask questions she doesn't need the answers to." Marin unwrapped her arm from around her ribs slowly. Even that small motion sent a white line of pain across her side, and she made no sound at all because she was her father's daughter, and Frank Calloway had taught her that pain was just information about the body and did not require an audience. Holt watched her face when she moved. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that recognized what he was seeing in the particular way of someone who had seen it before. He did not say anything about it. He climbed down from the wagon gate and went to the front of the wagon and came back with a small kit, and he set it on the gate beside her, and he said, "I'll have Vera look at you properly when we get to the ranch. For now, tell me if you need me to stop for anything." "I won't need you to stop." "All right." He picked up the lantern. "You can stay back here, or you can ride up front. It's a better road if you're looking at it." Marin considered him one more time. The lantern light was going from dark to the first pale gray of early morning, and the Wyoming land around them was flat and enormous, and entirely indifferent to her situation the way land was. She picked up the codebook and climbed down from the wagon. She did not ride up front because she trusted him. She rode up front because the alternative was lying on her back in a cattle wagon for 2 hours with broken ribs and nothing to do but listen to her own thoughts, and her thoughts at the moment were not particularly useful company. He made room for her on the driver's seat without comment. They rode in silence for a while. The light came up slow and gray over the flat country, and the horses moved at an easy, consistent pace that was nothing like the desperate dark road running she had done to get herself here. Marin held the codebook in her lap and kept her breathing shallow and tried not to think about whether Devlin had found the burned certificate yet. "That's a telegraph codebook," Holt said. She looked at him. He was watching the road. "Yes." "Standard Northern Pacific notation or something else?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "You know the difference." "I spent 2 years on a cattle drive that ran parallel to a Northern Pacific survey line. Watched their operators work most of a winter." He guided the horses around a rough patch. "Standard notation uses a 4-beat rhythm for numbers. The book you're carrying has a different spine than the Northern Pacific issue." "My father developed his own notation," Marin said before she had quite decided to say it. "He found the standard system inefficient for long transmissions in bad weather. His version runs cleaner in electrical interference." She paused. "He ran the Laramie Telegraph office for 19 years. "Frank Calloway," Holt said. She looked at him again. "I knew his work," Holt said simply. "He got a message through for me during the blizzard of '79 when every other line in the territory was down. Message saved my east herd from a bad purchase." He glanced at her. He died last winter. I heard about it. January, Marin said. Her voice came out flat and final the way it always did when she said it. Fever. Holt nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated more than she would have been able to explain to him. She had spent 6 weeks listening to people say they were sorry, in the particular way that meant they were moving the conversation toward whatever they wanted from her, and the simplicity of a man who just nodded and let the fact sit there was something she had almost forgotten was possible. The license to operate the station, he said after a moment. It's in your father's name. Yes. And the renewal comes up in the spring. She looked at him steadily. You know a great deal about a telegraph office you visited once. I know about the Railroad Commission's interest in the Laramie line, he said. The Northern Pacific is negotiating a junction expansion. The station that controls the primary communication line for the junction is worth a considerable amount of money to the right buyer. He paused. I didn't know it was Frank Calloway's station until you told me. Now I do. Marin was quiet. The code book felt heavier in her lap than it had a moment ago. The man I was married to, she said carefully, is a lawyer in Laramie. All right. He represents several interests connected to the Railroad Commission. All right. She looked at him. You understand what I'm telling you. I understand that you're running from a man who has financial reasons to want control of your father's station, in addition to whatever personal reasons he might have. He kept his eyes on the road. And I understand that you're the legal heir to that station, and that the codebook you're carrying is the only operational document that makes the station function the way your father built it to function. He paused. Which makes you considerably more valuable to him than just a wife. The word wife landed the way it always landed when it referred to her, like something that had been used badly and put back wrong. He's going to file a claim, she said. He's going to file a competency petition. He's been threatening it for 3 months. She kept her voice even. In Wyoming territory, a husband can petition to have his wife declared legally incompetent to inherit. If the petition succeeds, the inheritance reverts to the marital estate. She looked at the road ahead. Which means him. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Has he filed yet? Not when I left. He was waiting to see if I'd come back on my own. She paused. I left 6 days ago. I think his patience has run out by now. Then we've got some time, Holt said. Not a lot. Some. Marin heard the we and said nothing about it. It was too early to know what it meant. The Saddleback Ridge Ranch came into view 40 minutes later, and it was not what she had been preparing herself for. She had been building a picture in her mind of a working property run by a single man, serviceable and sparse, the kind of place that got by on necessity rather than attention. What she saw instead was a ranch that showed care in its details. Fences in clean repair, a barn that had been recently re-roofed, 3 horses in the near corral that moved with the easy confidence of animals that were well handled and well fed. There was a woman standing on the porch of the main house with her arms crossed watching the wagon come in with an expression that had not yet decided how it felt about what it was seeing. That's Vera, Holt said. She's going to have something to say. I can handle something to say, Marin said. Yes, he said. I think you can. He pulled the wagon up near the barn, and before he had set the brake, the woman named Vera Hutchins was coming down the porch steps with the purposeful stride of someone who had covered a great deal of ground in difficult circumstances and saw no reason to do it slowly. She was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered with iron-gray hair, and eyes the color of weathered wood that were doing a rapid and thorough inventory of the situation. She looked at Marin. She looked at the codebook. She looked at Holt. You want to explain what you're bringing home at sunrise, she said. It was not quite a question. This is Marin Calloway, Holt said, climbing down. Frank Calloway's daughter. She's a trained telegraph operator. She needs a room and she needs her ribs looked at. Vera's eyes went back to Marin, and they moved over her with the particular focused attention of someone who was not looking at a woman but at an injury pattern. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Calloway out of Laramie," she said. "Yes," Marin said. "Your father's saddle repair work is on 2 of our bridles. Caleb bought them off a man who was closing out." Vera paused. "That's not what I'm looking at." "I know it isn't." Vera held her gaze for a long moment, the kind of look that was making a decision. Then she turned and walked back up the porch steps, and her voice came over her shoulder, the way a woman's voice comes when she has already moved on to the next item on the list. "Get Holt's horses. Danny, stop whatever you're doing and come help me with the stove. We've got company." She held the door open without turning. "Miss Calloway, inside." Marin stood beside the wagon for a moment. A young man of perhaps 20 came out of the barn at a near run, tripping slightly over a loose board on the barn threshold and recovering without drama. A broader, quieter figure appeared from the far side of the corral, a man in his mid-40s who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. He looked at Marin with a steady, measuring gaze. Then he looked at Holt. Holt said quietly, "She needs safe ground, Cy." The man named Cy Pruitt looked at Marin for another moment. Then he looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face in the particular way of someone who was filing the details somewhere very organized. He said, "All right." And he took the horses' leads and walked them toward the barn without another word. Marin followed Vera inside. The kitchen was large and ordered and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and Vera sat Marin down at the table without ceremony and stood in front of her with her arms crossed and said, "I'm going to tell you what I see. You can correct me where I'm wrong." "All right," Marin said. "3 cracked ribs, possibly 4 on the left side from the way you're protecting that shoulder. Split lip, 3 days healed. Bruising on the left wrist, consistent with a grip, not a fall. Bruising at the left temple, older, going yellow at the edges, which puts it at 5 to 7 days. Vera paused. "There may be more I can't see with your dress on. I won't ask about what I can't see unless you tell me it matters." Marin said nothing for a moment. "The temple was the last time," she said finally. "I left that night." Vera nodded once. The same kind of nod Holt had used, the kind that meant the fact had been received and placed somewhere without commentary. "I'll wrap the ribs properly," Vera said. "It's going to hurt for about 30 seconds, and then it's going to hurt considerably less than it does right now." She went to the cabinet. "You take coffee." "Plain," Marin said. "Thank you." Vera wrapped the ribs with the brisk, practiced competence of a woman who had wrapped worse in worse places, and she did it without asking Marin to explain anything, which was the most merciful thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could clearly remember. When it was done, she poured the coffee and sat down across the table and said, "Crawford Devlin Marsh." Marin went still. "I get news from Laramie through the supply runs," Vera said, in the same calm tone she had used for everything else. "Man's been filing motions with the Territorial Commission for the better part of 4 months, trying to establish control over the Calloway station license. Word got around. People in the telegraph business talk." She looked at Marin over her cup. "I didn't know it was Frank Calloway's daughter he was married to." "Does that change anything?" Marin asked. Vera set down her cup and looked at her directly for the first time since they had sat down. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She held Marin's gaze for a moment. "You ran. You had your father's code book." "Yes." "That code book belongs to you." It was not a question, and Marin felt something in her throat tighten at the plain directness of it. "Yes," she said. "It does." "Then you're going to stay here until we figure out how to prove that in a way that holds in a territorial court," Vera said. She stood up and went back to the stove. "Your father's name is on the operating license, and you're the legal heir. That's a foundation. It's not a guarantee, but it's a foundation." She poured herself more coffee without turning. Marsh is going to file the competency petition the moment he can't find you, which means we have a window." "How large a window?" Marin said. "Small," Vera said. "Smaller if he's already moving." Marin wrapped both hands around her cup and felt the warmth of it and looked at the codebook sitting on the table in front of her. Her father's handwriting was on the spine. His notation for the primary line, his initials in the bottom corner, in the careful, even hand she had tried to copy for years before she understood that her own hand was already its own thing. She thought about the morning she had come home from the telegraph office at 19 to find her father sitting at this same kind of kitchen table in Laramie with the code book open and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. And he had looked up and said, "Marin, sit down. I want to show you something." And she had sat down, and he had shown her the notation system he had spent 3 years developing, and he had said, "This is the work. This is what we do. And someday this is going to be yours, and you're going to make it better than I did." She had not made it better yet. She had spent the past 4 years maintaining it under circumstances that did not allow for improvement under a husband who had looked at her father's life work and seen a financial instrument and nothing else, under a man whose patience was the patience of someone waiting for the right moment to close a hand around something and not let go. She heard boots on the porch. The door opened, and Holt Decker came in and stopped inside the threshold, in the way she had already noticed. He entered rooms without expanding into them, without claiming the space which was unusual in a man in his own house. "Vera," he said. "She's wrapped and she's had coffee," Vera said. "Don't bother her for at least another hour." "I wasn't going to bother her." He looked at Marin. "Cy wants to know about the competency petition. He's got information about how Marsh files them. He says you should know what you're up against before you decide what to do next." Marin looked at him. "Cy knows about competency petitions specifically." "Cy knows about a lot of things specifically," Holt said. "He spent 6 years with the Pinkerton agency before he came to work here. The legal mechanisms that men use to take things from people who have a right to them are things he has encountered before." "Will he talk to me directly?" "That's up to him. He doesn't talk to everyone. He'll talk to people he thinks are worth talking to." Holt paused. "He watched you walk across the yard this morning. He's decided." Vera made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close to it. Marin looked at the codebook on the table. She thought about Devlin Marsh, sitting in his office in Laramie right now, or possibly already moving, possibly already filing with his careful voice and his courthouse connections, and his cold certainty that a woman who ran from him was property that had wandered off its proper ground. She thought about her father's voice. "This is the work. Someday, this is going to be yours." She picked up the codebook and put it in her satchel and stood up. "Tell Cy I'll talk to him now," she said. "I don't have time to wait." Holt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing something she could not entirely read, but that was not the expression of a man doing a calculation. It was the expression of a man who had formed a preliminary opinion and was watching to see if the evidence supported it. "All right," he said. He held the door. Marin walked out into the morning light of the Saddleback Ridge Ranch with her father's codebook in her satchel, and her ribs wrapped tight, and her lips still healing, and her husband's filed petition already taking shape somewhere in the territorial court system. She walked toward the tall, quiet figure of Cy Pruitt, standing near the corral fence, with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned which details mattered and which ones didn't. He watched her come toward him, and he said nothing until she was close enough to talk without raising her voice. Then he said, "He's going to file in the next 3 days, maybe 2. "I know," Marin said. "He's going to need a doctor in Laramie to sign the medical declaration. That's the weak point. The petition doesn't move without the declaration. Who are the doctors in Laramie who would sign for him?" Cy looked at her with a slight shift in expression that was the closest thing she had seen to approval on his face. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question." Behind her, she could hear Vera's voice in the kitchen, could hear Holt talking to the young man Danny about something to do with the north fence, could hear the horses moving in the corral, with the easy rhythm of animals, in a place that had been consistent with them for a long time. Marin Calloway stood on the working ground of the Saddleback Ridge Ranch in the early Wyoming morning, and felt for the first time, in longer than she could clearly name, the particular sensation of standing on ground that was solid under her feet, with a problem in front of her that had a shape she could understand and hands she already knew how to use. Devlin Marsh was coming. She knew that the way she knew the weather from the wire, not because she could see it yet, but because every signal preceding it was pointing in the same direction. But she had the code book. She had her father's notation, her father's work, her father's name on a license that was legally hers. She had a woman who had wrapped her ribs without asking her to explain them, and a man with 6 years of Pinkerton knowledge who was already thinking about weak points, and another man who had found her bleeding in his wagon at 4 a.m, and had offered her work and a room, and nobody on his land telling Devlin Marsh where she was. She was not safe. She was not certain. But she was standing on ground that was real beneath her feet, and she had work to do, and for the first time in 14 months she had a direction to move in that was not simply a way. She looked at Cy Pruitt. "Tell me everything you know about the petition process," she said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Cy Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." And he began to talk. Cy Pruitt talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and Marin listened to every word with the focused attention of someone who understood that the information being given to her had a shelf life, and that shelf life was measured in days, possibly hours. The competency petition process in Wyoming Territory. Cy explained, required 3 things to move forward. A written declaration from a licensed physician stating that the petitioned party demonstrated signs of mental or emotional instability. A corroborating statement from a witness with direct knowledge of the petitioned party's behavior. And a filing fee paid to the territorial court clerk, which Devlin Marsh could produce before breakfast without blinking. "The doctor is the cornerstone," Cy said. He was leaning against the corral fence with his arms crossed, watching the horses, the way he watched everything with peripheral attention that missed nothing. Without the medical declaration, the petition is just a piece of paper with a man's bad intentions on it. A territorial judge won't move on it. How many doctors in Laramie would sign for him? 2 who owe him professional favors, 1 who owes him money. Cy paused. A 4th who won't touch it under any circumstances, man named Dr. Aldous Finch. He's been practicing in Laramie for 23 years, and he has the specific stubbornness of a man who has watched the law be used badly long enough to have strong opinions about it. Marin looked at him. "You know Laramie's medical community specifically." "I had a case there in 78, Cy said in the tone he used when he was acknowledging a fact without illuminating it further. Finch testified in a competency hearing. He was the only doctor in the county who refused to sign a declaration he didn't believe in. The man whose petition it was had considerably more money and considerably more courthouse connections than Devlin Marsh. He paused. Finch still refused. "Could Finch testify on my behalf?" "If he's willing. He knew your father. He was one of the men Frank Calloway got a message through for during the 79 blizzard." Cy looked at her. Whether that extends to putting himself in front of Marsh's lawyers is a different question. "What kind of man is he?" Cy was quiet for a moment. "Honest," he said, "in the way that costs something." Marin filed that away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to act on yet, but couldn't afford to forget. She spent the rest of that first morning in a room at the end of the upstairs hall, small and clean, with a window that faced the corral. Vera had left a basins of water and clean towels and had said nothing else, which was exactly the right amount of anything to say. Marin sat on the edge of the bed with her father's codebook open in her lap and went through it the way she went through it every few weeks, not reading it, just touching it, following the notation system her father had developed, the way you follow a familiar road in the dark. She had not cried since she left Laramie. She did not cry now. The feeling that moved through her when she ran her fingers over her father's handwriting was not grief exactly, not anymore. It was more like the particular ache of a joint that has been broken and healed, and will always know when the weather is changing. It was there. It was information. It did not require anything from her. What her father had built was real. 19 years of service to a territory that needed reliable communication more than it needed almost anything else. 347 messages transmitted during the blizzard of '79 when every other line in the territory was down because Frank Calloway had developed a notation system that ran cleaner in electrical interference than the standard issue and had trained his equipment accordingly. The operating license bore his name and would transfer to her legally at the spring renewal unless something prevented it. Devlin Marsh intended to be that something. She closed the code book and looked at the window and thought about what Cy had said about the 3-day window, and she thought about the burned marriage certificate on the kitchen stove back in Laramie and whether burning it had been the right instinct or the wrong one, and she thought about the fact that she could not afford to be wrong about very much in the next 2 weeks. She was still thinking when she heard the knock at the door. "Come in," she said. It was Holt. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, in the particular way of a man who had manners about entering a woman's room that were not performed manners, but actual ones. He looked at the code book in her lap. "Vera said you should eat something," he said. "She also said to tell you she's not asking, she's informing." Despite everything, something moved in Marin's expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to the shape of one. "I'll come down," she said. They ate at the long kitchen table, all of them together, which Marin had not expected. The young hand named Danny ate with the cheerful appetite of someone who had not yet learned to be self-conscious about it, and Cy ate with the economy of a man who treated food as fuel and had no complaints about the fuel. Vera ate and talked about the state of the North Pasture fence, with the authority of someone whose opinion on the North Pasture fence was not a suggestion, but a directive. Holt ate and said little. At one point, he passed the bread basket across the table to Marin without looking up from his plate because it was in front of him and she was reaching for it, and the simplicity of the gesture landed somewhere in her chest in a way that was disproportionate to the gesture itself. The way small, ordinary things can be disproportionate when you have been living for a long time in a house where small, ordinary things were not ordinary. After supper, Cy spread a territorial map on the kitchen table and pointed to 3 locations without preamble. Laramie Courthouse, Dr. Finch's office on the east side of town, the telegraph relay station at the northern junction. He tapped the last point. This is where the Northern Pacific Commission is doing its assessment. The station your father built sits directly on the primary communication line. Without the Calloway notation system, the relay doesn't function at full capacity. The railroad knows this. Marsh knows this. If he gets the competency petition filed before I can establish my legal standing at the renewal, Marin said the license goes into contested status. And contested status means a freeze on the renewal, Cy said, which means the Northern Pacific can't complete the junction assessment, which means the entire commission deal stalls. He looked at her. A stalled deal costs the railroad significant money. A man who can resolve the stall by delivering a clear operating license has significant leverage. Marsh, Holt said. Marsh. Cy agreed. Marin looked at the map. She traced the line from Laramie to the junction relay with one finger. Her father had run that line for 19 years. He had repaired it himself after the '79 blizzard brought down 2 support towers, had ridden out in weather that closed every other business in the county to reset the line because the line needed to be running, and he was the one who knew how to run it. "When does the Railroad Commission next meet?" she said. 3 weeks, C said. March 14th. That's the window. Yes. If I can establish my legal standing to inherit the license before March 14th, Marsh's petition becomes moot. The renewal goes through in my name, and the railroad has their clear operating title. And Marsh has nothing, Holt said. He has nothing. Marin agreed. She looked at the map for another moment. I need to get to Laramie. I need to speak to Dr. Finch, and I need to find out whether my father left any documentation that explicitly designates the codebook as personal property rather than station property. Marsh is going to have people watching, Cy said. I know. He knows you'd go back for the documentation. I know that too. She looked at Cy. Is there anyone in Laramie who can move in the station before I get there? Someone who knew my father's operation well enough to know where he kept his personal files. Cy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There's a woman named Cora Tessler. She was the day operator at the Laramie station for 6 years under your father. She has no love for Devlin Marsh. He tried to have her dismissed from the position when he first started maneuvering on the license because she knew the operation too well and he knew she'd be a problem. Was she dismissed? No. The Territorial Communications Office overruled him. She's still there. Cy paused. She knows where your father kept everything. She knows the difference between station property and Frank Calloway's personal equipment. And she has opinions about men who try to leverage dead men's life work into personal gain that she expresses quite directly. Marin looked at him. Will she talk to me? I think she's been waiting for someone to ask her the right questions for 6 months, C said. I think when you show up, she's going to say more than you can write down. Holt had been listening to all of this with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was deciding about. He had not interrupted once. He picked up his coffee cup, turned it once in his hands, and set it down. Cy rides with you when you go, he said. It was not a question. I was going to say the same thing, Cy said. Marin looked at Holt. You don't need to involve yourself further in this. You've already done more than... You're an employee on this property, Holt said. His voice was the same steady level thing it always was, not raised, not performing. That means you're under my protection. That's not a courtesy. It's a fact. He held her gaze. If Marsh wants to dispute it, he can dispute it in front of Judge Aldridge in Casper, who is not particularly impressed by Laramie lawyers. Marin heard this carefully. She had heard men say things about protection before. She had learned the hard way that there were 2 kinds of protection. The kind that shielded you, and the kind that replaced one set of walls with another. She looked at Holt's face and did the reading she had learned to do under the worst possible conditions, the reading that could not afford to be wrong. There was no architecture around what he had said. No condition attached to it, no implication of what she would owe for it. It sat there the way a fence post sits after it's been driven and tested solid without announcing itself. All right, she said. Then Cy rides with me. Vera, who had been washing dishes through the entire conversation with her back to the table, said without turning. You leave before sunrise, both of you. Danny, don't look like that you're not going anywhere. She set a cup on the shelf. And Cy, you take the northern trail into Laramie, not the post road. The post road is where Marsh's man will be watching. Cy looked at Vera. I was going to say the same thing. I know you were, Vera said. I'm saying it first, so it's on the record. That night, Marin sat at the small desk in her room with the code book open and a sheet of paper in front of her, and wrote out from memory every piece of documentation she knew her father had kept regarding the station's operations and his personal property. She was methodical about it, working the way her father had worked, from the known outward to the probable, from the concrete toward the inferential. Her father had kept 2 files. She knew this because she had watched him keep them since she was old enough to understand what files were. A station file for all operational records equipment, logs, maintenance reports, the correspondence with the Territorial Communications Office that governed the license. And a personal file for everything that was his. His notation development notes, the original codebook drafts, the letters he had exchanged with other telegraph operators across the territory over 20 years. The personal file, if it still existed intact, would establish clearly that the codebook was his personal intellectual property, not station equipment. That distinction mattered in a territorial court in the same way that any distinction between a man's personal tools and his business equipment mattered. Ruth had taught her that in the oblique way that Cy mentioned his Pinkerton cases by talking about the principles without naming the specific histories behind them. She paused in her writing. She thought about the fact that Devlin had been inside the station office 6 times in the past 4 months on various legal pretexts. She thought about the fact that he was a careful man who understood documentation and understood which documents were problems for him. She thought about what Cy had said about Bull's lawyers removing files from a workshop, and she thought that the pattern was not unique to one story. She picked up her pen and added to the list, determine whether personal files are intact or have been accessed. She also wrote Cora Tessler, ask specifically about the night of February 4th. February 4th was the night Marin had left. If Devlin had gone to the station that night, which she believed he had, Cora would have seen it. Cora would know if anything had been taken. She was still writing when she heard a quiet sound on the stairs, not approaching her door, but pausing on the landing. Then Holt's voice low and even through the door. "Lights on late," he said. "Just checking." Marin looked at the door. "I'm working," she said. A pause. "All right." Another pause. "Vera left biscuits in the kitchen if you need something." She almost said she was fine. She said instead, "Thank you." She heard him go back down the stairs, and she sat for a moment with her pen in her hand and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. The horses in the corral, the distant sound of the wind across the flat country, the creak of the house in the particular way that houses with solid construction creak from settling rather than weakness. She thought about Devlin's house in Laramie. The sounds it made at night had been different. Every sound had been something she was listening for, something she was categorizing for threat level. She had not slept without that categorization in 14 months. She was doing it now, automatically sorting the sounds of the Saddleback Ridge Ranch, the way she had sorted the sounds of that house. The difference was that there was nothing here that raised the level. She turned back to her paper and kept writing. When the list was complete, she folded it and put it inside the code book and closed the book and set it on the nightstand where she could see it from the bed. She thought about what lay ahead. Laramie, Cora Tessler, Dr. Finch, the personal files, 3 weeks until the Railroad Commission meeting, and Devlin Marsh already moving, already calculating, already filing documents in his careful lawyer's hand that were designed to take from her the one thing her father had built his entire working life to leave behind. She thought about what Holt had said. "That's not a courtesy. It's a fact." She thought about her father sitting at his desk on a January morning 6 years ago, opening the codebook to a fresh page writing notation examples in the careful hand she knew better than her own and saying, "Marin, pay attention." This part is important. She had paid attention. Every day for 19 years she had paid attention. She knew every line of what her father had built. She knew it better than Devlin Marsh knew his own name, better than any railroad commissioner knew his own filing system, better than anyone who had ever looked at the Callaway station as a financial instrument rather than a life's work. That knowledge was not going to be taken from her. Not by a petition, not by a lawyer with courthouse connections and a cold, patient smile. Not by any document that tried to say she was not her father's daughter, in full possession of what he had always meant for her to have. She blew out the lamp. She lay down and looked at the dark shape of the codebook on the nightstand, the familiar worn outline of the spine, the slight unevenness of the leather cover, where her father had pressed it flat one too many times on a hard surface. She slept before she had finished worrying. That was not something she had done in a long time. And she noticed it, and then sleep took the noticing away, and left only the dark and the sounds of a ranch at rest, and the first quiet in months that felt like something other than a trap. They left before the sky had any color in it, just Cy and Marin riding out of Saddleback Ridge in the particular darkness that exists in the hour before dawn, when even the stars seem to be considering whether to continue the effort. Vera had left provisions on the kitchen table without comment. Holt had walked out to the horses with them and checked the saddles with his own hands, and before Marin had mounted, he had looked at her directly and said, "You find something you can't handle alone, you send word and I'll come. Don't decide not to send it because you think you should be able to handle it. Marin had looked at him. "I've been handling things alone for a long time." "I know that," he said. "I'm not questioning it. I'm telling you the option exists." She had nodded and mounted and ridden out, and she had not looked back, but she had heard him standing there until the sound of the hooves swallowed everything else. Cy took the northern trail into Laramie, the way Vera had directed, a longer route that added nearly 2 hours to the ride, but kept them off the post road where any man Devlin had stationed would be watching. Cy rode without conversation for the first stretch, which Marin appreciated. She needed the silence to organize what she knew and what she needed and what she was afraid of finding when she got there. What she was afraid of finding was the personal files gone. She had told herself, since she left, that her father's documentation was intact, that Devlin had not yet thought to move on it, or had not yet found a legal pretext to access it. But she knew that was not certainty. That was hope, which was a different thing entirely, and she had learned not to confuse the two. They were 2 hours out when Cy said without preface, "Cora Tessler is going to ask you something before she tells you anything." "What will she ask?" "She's going to ask why you didn't leave sooner." He kept his eyes on the trail. "She watched what was happening for 4 years. She knew. She's the kind of woman who will need to know that you know she knew, and that you're not going to spend energy pretending you had her fooled." Marin was quiet for a moment. "I didn't leave sooner because I thought it would get better," she said. "And then I didn't leave because I thought it couldn't get worse. And then it got worse and I left." She paused. "That's the honest answer." "That's the answer she'll respect," Cy said. They reached the outskirts of Laramie in the early afternoon. The town looked the same way it always looked to Marin when she came back to it after any absence, familiar and uncomfortable in the particular way of a place that knows too much about you. She had grown up on these streets. Her father had walked these streets for 30 years. The telegraph office, where she had learned to work, was 2 blocks east of the main road, and she did not look at it when they passed the turning. Cy directed them to Cora Tessler's house on the north side of town, a small place with a kitchen garden showing the first stubborn growth of early spring. Marin knocked. The door opened almost immediately, which meant Cora had heard the horses and had been watching from the window. She was 53 years old, compact and sharp-eyed, with the particular alertness of someone who processed information for a living and had never learned to turn it off. She looked at Marin. She looked at Cy. She looked at Marin's face with the specific attention of a woman reading what was in it, not what was presented. "You look better than I expected," Cora said. "That's either good news or you've gotten very good at looking better than you are." "Both," Marin said. Cora opened the door wider. "Come in." They sat at Cora's kitchen table, and Cora put coffee on without asking, and before she sat down she turned and looked at Marin and said, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" It was not a question, and Marin heard that and answered it the way she had told Cy she would. Straight through, no gaps, no performance of explanation. When she finished, Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down and wrapped her hands around her cup and said, "All right." "He's going to file the competency petition," Marin said. "Cy thinks within the next 3 days." "He's already filed it," Cora said. The kitchen went very still. "When?" Cy said. "Yesterday morning. I heard from the court clerk by noon." Cora looked at Marin steadily. "Dr. Harlan signed the declaration. He's the one who owes Devlin money. The corroborating statement was signed by your Uncle Bernard, who hasn't spoken to you in 4 years, but apparently has strong opinions about your mental stability." Marin felt the cold clarity move through her that had been her body's response to serious information since she was a child in her father's office, learning that a downed line in bad weather was not a catastrophe, but a problem with a specific solution that needed to be found before the weather got worse. "Has Judge Willard accepted the filing?" she said. "Not yet. It has to be reviewed by the clerk of the territorial court first. That review takes 5 to 7 business days." Cora paused. "You have a window, Marin. Small. The personal files, Marin said. My father's personal documentation. Are they intact? Cora set down her cup. She looked at the table for a moment in a way that meant she was choosing how to say what she was about to say. He sent someone into the station on February 5th, she said. The morning after you left. A man named Garrett, who is Devlin's associate from the courthouse. He had a letter from Devlin claiming legal authority to access the station records for purposes of evaluating the marital estate. She looked up. I told him he could access the station operational records because those were governed by the Territorial Communications Office and not by Devlin Marsh's letterhead. I told him your father's personal files were personal property and were not available under that authority. Did he take anything? He tried to take the codebook development notes. Cora's voice was flat and precise. I told him those were your father's private intellectual property, and that if he put his hand on them, I would send a wire to the Territorial Communications Commissioner in Cheyenne before he made it to the door. She paused. He left without them. Marin exhaled. It was a careful exhale, controlled because her ribs were still reminding her to be careful. You kept them. I moved them the same day. They're not in the station anymore. Cora stood up and went to the cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, the one behind the door, and opened the lower drawer. She took out a leather folder tied with a cord and set it on the table. Your father gave me a copy of his notation development notes 3 years ago, she said. He said he wanted a version of them somewhere outside the station in case anything happened to the originals. He didn't say specifically what he was worried about. She looked at Marin. I think he knew the way your father always knew things a little ahead of when other people did. Marin reached out and put her hands on the folder. The cord was tied in the knot her father always used, a double loop that he had learned from a telegraph repairman in St. Louis, and used for everything after that. She recognized it the way she recognized his handwriting immediately, and in her body, before her mind had finished processing it. Is this enough? She said. For the territorial court. On its own, no, Cora said. She sat back down. But it establishes provenance. It shows the notation system was developed by your father independently, not as part of his station duties, which means it qualifies as personal intellectual property. Combined with the operational separation he maintained, it builds the argument. She paused. You need Dr. Finch. Cy said the same thing. Finch knew your father for 20 years. He knew the difference between Frank Calloway, the station operator, and Frank Calloway, the man who built something he intended to pass on. He attended the reading of your father's will. He can speak to the explicit designation of the codebook as personal property. Cora looked at Marin. He's been waiting for someone to ask him to. I know this because he told me so directly 3 months ago when Devlin started making his moves. Will he sign a declaration countering Harlan's medical statement? That is the question you need to ask him yourself, Cora said. What I can tell you is that Aldous Finch spent 23 years watching this town, and he does not like what he's seen in the past year. And he was very fond of your father, and he is not a man who does things by half. She paused. Go see him today, before Devlin knows you're in town. Cy was already standing. Does Devlin have someone watching Finch's office? Not that I know of, but he has someone watching the station. Cora looked at Marin. Don't go near the station. Whatever you think you need from there, you don't need it badly enough to walk into that. I won't, Marin said. She stood and picked up the leather folder and put it in her satchel alongside the codebook and felt the weight of both of them together. Her father's work and her father's evidence in the same place, which was where they belonged. Cora, she said, when Garrett came for the files, were you alone? Danny Henderson from the grain exchange was doing a delivery. He saw Garrett go in, and he saw him come out without anything. He'll say so if someone asks him. Cora met her eyes. I made sure he was there that morning. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I knew something was. Your father taught me that the wire is always telling you something. You just have to be listening. Marin looked at her for a moment. She thought about the woman who had worked 6 years in her father's station and had moved his files the morning after she left and had kept a copy of his notation development notes for 3 years in the cabinet behind her kitchen door, and who had put a witness in the room when Devlin's man came because she had been listening to the wire. "Thank you," Marin said. It was not enough, but it was what she had. "Don't thank me," Cora said. "Win." Dr. Aldous Finch's office was on the east side of town, in a building that had been there longer than most things in Laramie, solid and plain, in the way of structures built by people who intended them to last. Cy stayed with the horses, and Marin went in alone, because some conversations needed to be between the right two people without additional weight around them. Finch was 61 years old, and looked like what he was, a man who had seen a great deal, and had organized most of it into a working philosophy of what mattered and what didn't. He had a lined face and steady hands, and the particular composure of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to know that composure was a service you provided to the person receiving it. He looked at Marin when she came in. He looked at her face, at her hands, at the satchel across her body. He said, "Sit down, Marin. I've been expecting you." She sat. "You knew I'd come." "I knew someone would come eventually. I hoped it would be you." He folded his hands on the desk. "I heard you left. I was glad." "Devlin filed the petition yesterday." "I know. Harlan came to see me first before he went to Devlin. He asked me to sign the declaration jointly." Finch's voice was level and very dry. "I told him what I thought of that suggestion in terms I won't repeat in polite company. He signed alone. He signed for a man who holds his debt. That's not a medical opinion. That's a financial transaction." Finch looked at her. "I want to tell you something clearly, Marin, so there's no confusion about where I stand. Your father was the most honest man I knew in 30 years of practice in this town. He built something real, and he meant it for you. And I watched a small and greedy man spend the past 4 years trying to get his hands on it through a woman who deserved considerably better." He paused. "I will sign a counter-declaration. I will appear in person before Judge Willard or any other judge in this territory. I will say exactly what I know to be true about your father's intentions and your mental and legal competency, and I will say it in terms that Harlan's declaration is not going to survive." Marin looked at him. She had prepared herself for this conversation to require persuasion. She had prepared arguments and anticipated resistance, and had organized everything she knew into the most compelling order. She had not prepared for it to be this simple. "You understand what this puts you in front of," she said. "Devlin has connections in this courthouse." "Devlin Marsh has connections with Judge Willard's predecessor," Finch said. "Judge Willard came down from Cheyenne 8 months ago. He is not interested in the social architecture of Laramie lawyers." He looked at her over his glasses, in the way of a man who had sat in enough courtrooms to have informed opinions about judges. "He is interested in what the documents say. I know this because I testified in front of him last fall in a property dispute, and I watched him dismiss a claim that the previous judge would have ruled the other way on because the documents didn't support it." He paused. "You need to get me documents, Marin. What do you have?" She opened the satchel and put the leather folder on his desk. "My father's notation development notes. Cora Tesler kept a copy. They established that the codebook was developed as personal intellectual property, not as part of his station duties." Finch opened the folder and looked at the first page. He was quiet for a moment. "Frank's handwriting," he said, in a voice that had something different in it for just a moment. Then it was level again. "What else? His will designates the codebook and the notation system explicitly as personal property to be transferred to me. The will is on file with the Territorial Estate Office in Cheyenne." "I attended the reading," Finch said. "I can testify to its contents from direct knowledge." He turned another page. "The petition is going to argue that the competency question supersedes the inheritance designation. That if you are found legally incompetent, the will's provisions become void and the estate reverts. I know, Marin said. That's why the counter-declaration is the first wall. And the documentation is the second. Finch set the folder down. There's a third thing you need, and I want you to think carefully about whether you're willing to pursue it. He looked at her directly. Devlin Marsh used physical violence against you during the course of your marriage. I know this because I treated you in my office on 2 occasions and documented my observations at the time in my own records because I believed documentation would eventually matter. He paused. A man who petitions to have his wife declared incompetent while simultaneously holding documented evidence of violence against her is a man whose petition has a fundamental credibility problem before a judge who is paying attention. Marin was very still. You documented it, she said. Both visits. The second time you told me you had walked into a door. I wrote down what you said, and I wrote down what I observed, and I wrote down that the two were inconsistent. Finch held her gaze. I want your permission to include that documentation in my declaration. I won't do it without asking you directly. Marin looked at the satchel in her lap. She thought about the courthouse and about what it would mean to have that set in a room with other people in it, and written into a legal record that would exist after today. She thought about the women who never had anyone write it down. She thought about the fact that Devlin had counted on her being too afraid or too ashamed to let anyone say it plainly. She thought about her father's voice. Pay attention. This part is important. Yes, she said. You have my permission. Finch nodded once. He picked up his pen. I'll have the declaration ready by tomorrow morning. You should not be in Laramie tonight. Devlin will know you're here before dark, and I want you and your documentation somewhere he can't reach without a court order. He paused. Where are you staying? Saddleback Ridge Ranch, she said. Outside Casper. Outside. Finch looked at her. Holt Decker's ranch. Yes. Something moved in Finch's expression that was close to the first thing approaching relief she had seen in a medical man's face in a long time. Your father spoke well of Holt Decker, he said. Said he was a man who understood the difference between what belonged to him and what didn't. He stood and extended his hand. Tomorrow morning, Miss Calloway. I'll have everything you need. She was back on the street in 20 minutes, and Cy read her face before she said a word. He'll sign, Cy said. He already documented the injuries. Marin mounted. 2 visits. He kept records. Cy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father chose his friends carefully. Yes, Marin said. He did. They rode out of Laramie on the northern trail before the sun had fully set, with the leather folder in Marin's satchel, and Finch's declaration coming in the morning, and the petition already filed, and sitting in the clerk's office, waiting for its 5 to 7 day review. The window was small, and getting smaller, and there was still work to do before it closed. But there was a counter-declaration coming from a man who had written down the truth on 2 separate occasions, because he had believed it would eventually matter. There was Cora Tessler's witness, and the development notes, and the will in Cheyenne, and Cora's copy of the notation system that Devlin Marsh's associate had tried to take and had left behind. Marin held the satchel against her side as the horses moved north, and thought about what her father had built piece by piece, day by day, for 19 years, with the particular patience of someone who understood that you did not build something to last by rushing the joints. The joints were holding. She kept riding north toward the ranch and toward whatever came next, with the cold Wyoming night coming down around her and the code book against her ribs and the knowledge of everything she still needed to do sitting in her chest like a problem she had already started solving. They got back to Saddleback Ridge after midnight. The ranch was dark except for the kitchen light, which meant Vera had left it burning deliberately and had gone to bed, which was her way of saying she was not going to wait up, but she was not going to leave them in the dark either. Holt was sitting on the porch steps. He stood when he heard the horses, not quickly, not with the urgency of a man who had been worried and was covering it, but with the simple directness of a man who had been waiting and was done waiting. He looked at Marin first, when they rode in, the way he always looked at her first, and whatever he saw in her face settled something in his own. "Sigh," he said. "Petition's already filed." Sigh said, dismounting. "Harlan signed the declaration. Bernard Calloway signed the corroboration." Holt's jaw moved once. "How long on the clerk review?" 5 days, maybe 4. Sigh handed his reins to Danny, who had appeared from the barn with the alert expression of someone who had been sleeping lightly and listening. "But Finch is signing a counter-declaration tomorrow morning, and he has documentation from 2 prior visits that goes directly to the petition's credibility." Holt looked at Marin. "He documented the injuries." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite of it, feeling that had been organized into something useful before it was allowed to show. "Come inside," he said. Vera left supper on the stove. Marin had not thought she was hungry until she smelled the kitchen, and then she understood that she had not eaten since before they left that morning, which had been more than 15 hours ago. She sat at the table and ate without self-consciousness for the first time in longer than she could track, and Sigh ate across from her, and Holt sat at the end of the table with coffee and listened while Sigh went through everything in the ordered, precise way he went through information, starting with what was known and working toward what was probable. When Sigh finished, Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The clerk review can be challenged." Sigh looked at him. "On what basis?" "New material evidence submitted during the review period can trigger a mandatory extension. If Finch's counter-declaration and the notation development notes are submitted directly to the clerk's office before the review closes, Willard is required by territorial procedure to hold the petition open until he's reviewed everything." He paused. "That buys time." "How do you know territorial review procedure specifically?" Marin said. Holt looked at her. "The Railroad Commission tried to file an eminent domain claim on 40 acres of my east pasture 2 years ago. I spent 6 weeks in the Casper courthouse learning exactly how the filing and review process worked." His voice was level and matter-of-fact. "A man named Prescott handled it for me. He's a lawyer in Casper. He's the kind of lawyer who understands that the procedure exists to protect people and not just to process them." "Can Prescott work on a competency petition?" "He can work on anything that involves territorial court procedure and documents that need to say what they actually say." Holt set down his cup. "I'll ride to Casper in the morning and bring him back. You and Sigh ride back to Laramie and get Finch's declaration. We meet in Casper by midday, and Prescott files the extension challenge before the close of business." Sigh looked at the table for a moment, with the expression of someone checking the logic against everything he knew about how these things moved. Then he said, "That works." "It has to work fast," Marin said. "If Devlin finds out I was in Laramie today, he's going to move to accelerate the filing." "He already knows," Sigh said. "He had a man on the north side of town. I saw him when we left. He was at a distance, and I don't think he made us clearly, but he made the horses." Marin looked at Sigh. "You didn't say anything." "I'm saying it now." He was not apologetic about the timing. "I didn't want to say it on the road where it would change how you rode, and I needed you thinking about what came next, not what was behind us." She understood the reasoning. She did not entirely like it, but she understood it, and she filed it in the same place. She filed everything she understood, but had not decided how to feel about. Holt looked at her. "Are you all right to ride again tomorrow morning?" "Yes." "Your ribs?" "My ribs are wrapped and they're my ribs, and I know what they can manage." She held his gaze. "I'll be ready before dawn." He nodded, which was how he accepted things he had asked about and received a clear answer on. He did not push past a clear answer, which was something she had noticed about him in the way she noticed everything, carefully keeping accurate account. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the satchel and checked the leather folder, the way she checked the code book, running her fingers over the cord her father had tied, feeling the familiar knot, making sure everything she had brought back was still intact and real and in her hands. It was. She put the folder and the codebook side by side on the nightstand and looked at them for a moment. She thought about Finch saying your father chose his friends carefully, and she thought about Cora moving those files the morning after she left, and she thought about a knot tied in a particular way that her father had learned from a repairman in St. Louis and used for 30 years afterward because it worked, and he saw no reason to use anything else. She thought about Devlin's man on the north side of town, watching them leave. She thought about Devlin sitting in his office right now with that information and recalculating with the cold efficiency of a man who had always treated problems as variables to be managed rather than people to be reckoned with. She was not afraid. She noted the absence of fear, the way you note the absence of a familiar sound with some surprise, and then with the understanding that the sound had been replaced by something else. What she felt was the specific sharpened attention of someone who understood exactly what they were moving toward and had the tools they needed to get there. She lay down and slept. In the morning, Holt was already gone before she came downstairs, which meant he had left before first light for Casper. Vera was at the stove and did not turn when Marin came in. "Eat first," Vera said. "Then ride." Marin ate. Cy came in 5 minutes later and ate without sitting down, which was his version of urgency expressed with complete physical composure. Danny had the horses ready when they went out, and Marin checked the satchel one more time by feel before she mounted, and then they were moving back down the northern trail toward Laramie, with the early morning cold still sharp in the air, and the sky going from black to the deep blue that preceded actual dawn. Finch had the declaration ready exactly as he had said. He handed it to Marin at his office door at 7 in the morning with the calm of a man who had been up since before she had. The document was 6 pages, in Finch's precise medical hand, signed at the bottom of each page, and notarized by the territorial notary, 2 doors down, who had apparently also been summoned before sunrise. "Read it," Finch said. She read it standing in his doorway. It was the most thorough document she had seen since her father's will. It named every visit, every observation, every specific notation of inconsistency between what she had said and what Finch had seen. It addressed the competency claim directly stating in clinical and unambiguous language that Marin Calloway demonstrated no signs of mental or emotional instability, but rather demonstrated the specific adaptive behaviors of a person managing circumstances of ongoing harm, which was not instability, but its opposite. It stated that the petition filed by Devlin Marsh bore the hallmarks of an instrument designed to achieve financial and legal control, rather than to address genuine medical concern. And at the end, in a section that Marin had to read twice to make sure she had read it correctly, Finch had included a statement about Frank Calloway, about the reading of the will, about the explicit designation of the codebook and the notation system as personal intellectual property to be transferred to his daughter without condition. He had signed it as a witness present at the will reading. He had dated his signature. "This is everything," Marin said. "It's what I know," Finch said. "Which is what you needed." He looked at her over his glasses. "There's one more thing. Harlan came to see me last night." Marin looked up. "He came to ask me to reconsider signing jointly," Finch said. "To present the declaration as a consensus medical opinion rather than a single man's statement." He paused. "I told him that a consensus built on one honest man and one man signing for money was not a consensus. I told him that if he had signed a medical declaration, he did not believe and he had a problem considerably larger than my opinion of him." He looked at her steadily. "He is afraid, Marin. He signed for the debt, not for conviction. A man who signed without conviction will not hold when the declaration is directly challenged in court." "You think he'll withdraw it?" "I think he is weighing his debt against his license," Finch said. "And I think when he understands that Willard is going to look at both declarations and ask direct questions about the basis for each one, he is going to find that his debt has become the less expensive problem." He paused. "Do not count on it, but know it is possible." Marin put the declaration in the satchel with the same care she used for the codebook and the development notes, and she shook Finch's hand and she said, "I'll send word when it's done." "See that you do?" he said. "Your father would have wanted to know." She and Cy were back on the road to Casper within the hour. They pushed the horses at a pace that covered ground without punishing them, and Marin held the satchel against her side with one hand and thought about Willard and the clerk's office and Prescott, and what happened when everything they had was laid in front of a judge who cared about what the documents actually said. They reached Casper in the early afternoon and went directly to Prescott's office on the main street, which was a narrow room that smelled of paper and deliberate thought. Holt was already there, sitting across the desk from a small, serious man in his early 50s, with the particular expression of someone who had read a great deal of difficult material that morning and had organized his response to it. Prescott looked at Marin when she came in and said, "Miss Calloway, I've reviewed the filing. I've reviewed what Mr. Decker has told me. Show me what you brought back from Laramie." She put everything on the desk, the development notes, Finch's declaration. She named each document as she placed it the way she had learned to name things in her father's office without drama, with precision in the order that made the logic clear. Prescott read. He did not skim. He read every page of Finch's declaration with the attention of someone who was simultaneously reading the document and reading the case it built. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at the notation development notes and said, "Cora Tessler kept a copy of these for 3 years. Yes?" Marin said. "She'll say so under oath." "Yes." "And Danny Henderson from the Grain Exchange witnessed Garrett's attempt to access the files." "Yes." Prescott looked at the table for a moment. "The petition has 3 problems," he said. "The first problem is that Harlan's declaration is going to fall apart the moment Willard looks at it alongside Finch's counter-declaration and asks Harlan to specify the clinical basis for his competency determination. The second problem is that the financial relationship between Harlan and Devlin Marsh creates a conflict of interest that Willard will identify immediately, because it is exactly the kind of thing Willard looks for." He paused. "The third problem is that the competency petition was filed by a man who is simultaneously the primary financial beneficiary of the inheritance in question. That is not illegal, but it creates an appearance that a careful judge is going to want to address directly." "Willard is a careful judge," Cy said. "Willard is a very careful judge," Prescott agreed. He picked up Finch's declaration again and turned to the last section. "This notation about the will reading. Finch was a witness." "Yes." "The will is on file in Cheyenne." "Yes." "I'll request a certified copy this afternoon. It will arrive before the clerk's review closes if I send the wire now." He stood up. "I'm going to file a challenge to the review timeline based on new material evidence. That gives Willard 5 additional days minimum before he can act on the petition." He looked at Marin. "Use those days. If there is any other documentation, any letter your father wrote, any correspondence with the communications office that references the codebook, specifically find it." "There may be correspondence with the Territorial Communications Commissioner in Cheyenne," Marin said. "My father wrote to the commissioner twice about his notation system, asking about intellectual property protections for telegraph operators. I know he sent those letters because I helped him draft them. If those letters are on file in Cheyenne, they are public record, and I can obtain copies through the territorial court." Prescott looked at her with the expression of someone adding a calculation. "When did he send them?" 1879 and 1881. Before Devlin Marsh entered the picture. 2 years before, Marin said. Prescott looked at Holt. "A man who writes to the Territorial Commissioner in 1879 and 1881, asking about intellectual property protections for his notation system, is not a man whose personal files were intended to be subsumed into a business transfer in 1883. He picked up his pen. "I'll wire Cheyenne within the hour." Holt had been sitting through all of this, the way he sat through most things, with complete attention and complete stillness, not adding to what had been said, but not missing any of it. He looked at Marin now. "You're staying in Casper tonight," he said. "Both of you. Devlin knows you went to Laramie, and he knows you came back with something. He's going to move, and he's going to move in a direction he thinks you won't see coming." He paused. "I want you somewhere that isn't predictable tonight." "Vera is going to say something about that," Cy said. "Vera packed provisions for 3 days," Holt said. "She said so when I left this morning. She already knew." Cy made the sound that was his version of acknowledging that Vera was several steps ahead of the conversation at any given time. They stayed that night at a boarding house on the south end of Casper that Holt knew a clean and unremarkable place that asked no questions and provided serviceable meals. Cy took the room next to Marin's, which was his way of providing something without making a statement about it. At supper in the small dining room, Marin ate across from Holt, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with the petition, or the clerk review, or Devlin Marsh. Holt talked about the east pasture and the fence work he had been putting off since fall. Marin talked about her father's habit of reading telegraph transmissions aloud to himself when he was testing a new notation sequence, walking back and forth across the office floor, tapping his knee with 2 fingers for the rhythm. "He tested every sequence against bad weather conditions," she said. "He'd stand in the office during a storm and transmit with the window open so the electrical interference would be present. He said if the notation couldn't hold in interference, it wasn't worth using." Holt looked at her. "How old were you when you started learning the notation?" "7, she said. "He gave me a practice key when I was 7 and told me to send him a message every morning before breakfast. It took me 3 weeks before he could read what I was sending." She paused. "The day he could read it, he came to breakfast and tapped out my name on the edge of the table with his knife handle." She stopped. "That was the first time I understood what it meant to make something that worked." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He knew you were going to be the one to carry it." "He always said that." She looked at the table. "He used to say the work doesn't belong to the person who started it. It belongs to the person who keeps it honest." She paused. "He meant me. He always meant me." Holt looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was the way he looked at things he took seriously, not as an assessment, but as an acknowledgement. "I know he did," he said. Later after supper, Marin sat in the small parlor, the boarding house kept for guests, and opened the code book and read through the notation sequences the way she did when she needed to think, without forcing thinking, letting her eyes move over her father's handwriting while her mind worked on something else. She heard a quiet step in the doorway. Holt stood there, hat in his hands, in the same way he always stood in doorways that weren't entirely his. He looked at the code book. "He wrote in the margins," he said. She looked down at the page open in her lap. Her father had written small annotations throughout, adjustments and refinements, questions to himself about whether a sequence could be simplified, notes about specific weather conditions, where he had tested a particular notation and found it wanting. He kept improving it, she said, every year. He never thought it was finished. She turned a page. He used to say that a system that stops improving has started dying. Holt came in and sat down in the chair near the door, not across from her. Not close, just present in the room in the way he was present, which was without pressure. "My mother kept a record book," he said. "It came out quietly without announcement, in the way things came out of him when he had decided to say them. Not of tools or work. Of the things my brother and I said when we were small that she wanted to remember." He paused. "She died when I was 11. My father kept the book for a long time afterward. He used to take it out in the evenings and read it and not say anything." Marin looked at him. She understood what he was giving her with that, and she received it carefully. "He left you the ranch," she said. "He left me the debt on the ranch," Holt said. "I bought it clear with 9 years of wages." He looked at his hands. "He used to say that a thing you work for holds differently than a thing you're given. That the work goes into the structure and makes it stronger." He paused. "I used to think he was just being practical about money. I understand now he meant something else." He meant it's yours, Marin said, in a way that can't be contested. Holt looked at her. Yes, he said. That's what he meant. The room was quiet for a moment. The boarding house was settling into night around them, the small sounds of a building at rest, nothing that registered as threat, nothing that raised the level of attention she had been keeping since before she could name it as a habit. She thought about Devlin somewhere in Laramie tonight, recalculating, knowing she had been to Finch, knowing Cy had gone with her, knowing she had come back with something. She thought about the petition sitting in the clerk's office, and Prescott filing the extension challenge in the morning, and the letters in Cheyenne that her father had written in 1879 and 1881 because he had been thinking ahead of the problem the way he always thought ahead of the problem. He had prepared the ground. She was standing on it. She looked at Holt. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to Casper, for finding Prescott, for—" She stopped because the list was longer than she had words organized for at the moment. "You don't need to account for it," he said. "I want to," she said, "because I'm keeping accurate account of what people do, and I want you to know that I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the several things at once that it did when he had not decided yet whether to say what he was thinking. Then he said simply, "I know you are Marin. I know." She closed the codebook. She put it in the satchel alongside the development notes and Finch's declaration, everything in the same place, everything accounted for. Tomorrow, Prescott would file the extension challenge. Tomorrow, the letters from Cheyenne would be requested. Tomorrow, the window would either hold or begin to close, and she would need to be ready for both possibilities with the same quality of attention she had brought to every morning of her working life since she was 7 years old, sitting at a practice key, learning to send something that could be read. She was ready. She stood and said goodnight, and Holt said goodnight, and she went upstairs to her room and set the satchel on the nightstand where she could see it, and lay down in the dark, and thought about her father tapping her name on the breakfast table with his knife handle the morning he could finally read what she was sending. She thought not with certainty, not with anything so fragile as hope exactly, but with the particular solid weight of someone who had done the work and knew the structure would hold, that she was going to walk into that courthouse and say what was true and prove it with what her father had built, and Crawford Devlin Marsh was going to discover that the woman he had tried to make into a variable had been all along the one thing he had failed to calculate correctly. Her father's daughter. In full. Without a fraction set aside. Prescott filed the extension challenge at 8 in the morning, and by 9 o'clock, the clerk's office had confirmed the review period was extended by 5 days. It was not a victory. It was time, which was a different thing, and Marin understood the difference clearly enough not to confuse them. The wire to Cheyenne went out the same hour. Prescott had contacts in the Territorial Records Office who understood urgency when it was framed correctly, and he framed it correctly. And the confirmation came back before noon that the letters existed, that they were dated 1879 and 1881 respectively, and that certified copies would be dispatched by the afternoon stage. 2 days, Prescott said, looking at the confirmation. Maybe 3. Cheyenne moves at its own pace. We have 5 days on the extension, Cy said. 4 now, Prescott said. And Marsh is not going to sit still while we build the case. He looked at Marin. He's going to file a supplementary declaration. He's going to try to bring in a second medical opinion to shore up Harlan's statement. He's going to do whatever he can to accelerate the petition before Willard has time to review everything we're giving him. What can he do to accelerate it? Holt said. He can request an emergency hearing on the grounds that the subject of the petition is in active possession of contested property. Prescott set down the wire. The contested property being the codebook and the notation development notes. Marin looked at him steadily. He's going to argue that I shouldn't have the documentation while the petition is pending. He's going to argue exactly that. And if Willard grants the emergency hearing before the certified copies from Cheyenne arrive, We're arguing the case without the letters." Prescott paused. "The letters are important, Marin. They are your father speaking in his own voice before any of this began about exactly the question at the center of the petition. Without them, we have Finch's declaration and Cora's testimony and the development notes. That is a solid case. With the letters, it becomes a case that does not have a gap in it." "Then we don't let Marsh force a hearing before the letters arrive," Holt said. "And how do we prevent that?" C said. Holt looked at Prescott. "File a counter motion. If Marsh files for an emergency hearing, file immediately for a continuance on the grounds that material evidence from a territorial records office is in transit and cannot be reviewed in an expedited timeline without prejudicing the respondent's case." Prescott looked at him with the expression of someone who had not expected that from that direction. "That is correct procedure," he said carefully. "I know," Holt said. "Land dispute, 2 years ago. I learned the motions." "You learned them well." "I had reasons to." He looked at Marin. "If Marsh moves, Prescott moves the same day. We stay ahead of him by 1 step until those letters arrive. After that, we don't need to stay ahead. We need to stand still and let the record speak." Marin thought about her father's voice. "The wire is always telling you something. You just have to be listening." She was listening. Everything coming through was telling her the same thing. The structure was sound, and it was going to hold, if she did not flinch before it had the chance to. "All right," she said. "Then we wait." Waiting was the hardest part. She had always known this about herself, that she was built for the work of things, and not for the space between the work, and the 4 days that followed tested that knowledge with a thoroughness that she would not have chosen. She and Cy rode back to Saddleback Ridge that afternoon, and she worked in the mornings at the telegraph key that Holt had in the ranch office, a basic unit he used for ranch business, running notation sequences to keep her hands and mind occupied. Holt watched her work, once standing in the office doorway with his arms crossed, and said nothing, but she knew he was watching, and she did not mind it. On the second day, Prescott wired to say that Marsh had filed for an emergency hearing. On the same afternoon, Prescott filed the continuance motion. On the third day, Willard denied the emergency hearing request. Vera read the wire when it came in and said without turning from the stove, "Good." That was all. It was enough. On the fourth day, the certified copies arrived from Cheyenne, 2 letters in her father's handwriting, dated 1879 and 1881, addressed to the Territorial Communications Commissioner, asking in the careful and precise language of a man who had spent a lifetime making his meaning clear, whether the notation system he had developed for telegraph transmission qualified as personal intellectual property under territorial statute, and whether that designation could be formally recorded. The commissioner's responses were attached. Both confirmed the designation. Both were signed and dated and bore the territorial seal. Marin sat at the kitchen table and held the letters and read them twice. Her father had done this, had made the walk to the commissioner's office and sat down and written out his question and sent it and waited for the answer and received it and filed it somewhere she could find it when she needed it. He had done it 4 years before Devlin Marsh had entered their lives, before there was any specific threat to prepare against, simply because he was a man who thought ahead of problems and understood that the best time to build the foundation was before you needed to stand on it. She looked up. Holt was at the table across from her. He knew, she said. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew something would come, and he prepared for it. Yes, Holt said. He spent his whole life doing that, thinking ahead of the problem, building things that would hold. Holt looked at the letters on the table. He built you, he said simply. Marin looked at the letters and felt the particular grief that was not grief anymore, but something quieter and more durable than grief. The grief that has been lived with long enough to become part of the structure rather than a wound in it. She felt it move through her, and she let it, and she did not try to contain it or manage it, because she had learned that it moved faster when it was not managed. When it was done, she folded the letters carefully and put them in the satchel and said, "We ride to Casper tomorrow." The hearing was set for Thursday at 10 in the morning. Prescott had spent the previous 2 days filing the complete package of evidence with Willard's clerk, and the night before the hearing, he sat with Marin at his office table and walked her through what to expect with the brisk efficiency of a man who did not believe in surprises in courtrooms. "Marsh's lawyers are going to focus on 2 arguments," he said. "The first is that your departure from the marital home constitutes evidence of instability. The second is that your possession of the codebook and development notes during the period of the petition constitutes interference with contested property." And we respond how? To the first, a woman who left a dangerous situation with the documentation she needed to protect her legal inheritance is not demonstrating instability. She is demonstrating exactly the opposite. He looked at her. To the second, the petition's claim that those materials are contested property depends on the competency claim being valid. The competency claim is not valid. Therefore, the property is not contested. It is hers. He paused. It is circular logic on their part, and Willard will see it. But I want you to understand it clearly, so that when Garrett makes the argument in that room, you are not surprised by it, and your face does not show surprise. "My face will not show surprise," Marin said. Prescott looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't believe it will." She slept that night at the Casper boarding house with the satchel on the nightstand and the letters from Cheyenne folded inside the codebook, and everything accounted for everything in its place, every piece of the structure her father had built, and she had carried here intact and ready to be laid in front of a judge who cared about what the documents actually said. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the courtroom and about what it meant to say in a room full of people, in front of a record that would outlast the day that a man had done what Devlin Marsh had done. She thought about the women who never had the documentation. She thought about the women who never had a Finch who kept records, or a Cora who moved the files, or a Cy who understood weak points, or a Prescott who knew the motions. She thought about what her father had built, and what it meant that it existed, and that she had gotten here with it intact. She thought with the quiet certainty of someone standing on solid ground and testing it before they move, that she was going to say what was true and prove it with what she had, and that was going to be enough. Her father had made sure it was enough. In the morning, Holt knocked on the door at 6 and said through the door, "Vera sent biscuits in the saddlebag." Marin almost smiled. "Tell her thank you." "Tell her yourself when we get back," he said. "She'll want to hear it directly." They rode to the courthouse together, Marin and Holt and Cy, and the Wyoming morning was cold and clear, and the sky was the particular pale blue of early spring when the air is still sharp. But the light has started to remember itself. Marin rode with the satchel across her body, and her back straight, and her ribs aching in the dull, persistent way of things that were healed but not finished healing, and she felt the weight of everything in the satchel, and thought of it not as a burden, but as ballast, the thing that kept you level when the current pushed. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected, and more crowded. Word had moved through Casper the way word moved in small territories, and there were perhaps 25 people in the gallery, which for Willard's courtroom was a considerable attendance. Prescott told her quietly that several of them were Railroad Commission representatives, which meant the Northern Junction question had drawn its own interested parties to the proceeding. Devlin Marsh was already there. He was seated at his table with Garrett and a second lawyer she did not recognize, and his document case was open in front of him, and he had the composed stillness of a man who had paid for careful preparation and was content to let it work. He looked at Marin when she came in. She met his eyes for a moment the way she had learned to meet eyes in the past 4 years, steadily and without performance, and then she looked away. Not from discomfort, from the simple decision that he was not the person she needed to attend to today. She sat at Prescott's table and put the codebook in front of her the way Prescott had told her to, where Willard could see it throughout. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Judge Willard came in without ceremony and settled himself and reviewed the documents in front of him for 3 full minutes in silence before he looked up. He was a compact man in his early 60s with sharp eyes and the expression of someone who had sorted through a great deal of human dishonesty and had developed efficient methods for identifying it. He looked at both tables. "We're here on the petition of Marsh versus Calloway," he said. "A competency petition filed on the basis of a single medical declaration, subsequently challenged by a counter-declaration, and a motion disputing the review timeline. I have reviewed all filings. I have reviewed both medical declarations. I have reviewed the notation development notes, the certified copies of correspondence with the Territorial Communications Commissioner, and the deposition from Miss Tesler." He paused. "Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed." Garrett was precise and confident, and laid out Devlin's position with the efficient authority of a man who had won in rooms like this before. The marriage. The departure from the marital home. The possession of station-related materials during the petition period. The sole heir's instability as demonstrated by erratic behavior and flight. It was a clean argument. Marin sat through it with her hands folded and her face still, and listened to every word without reacting to any of it, the way her father had taught her to listen to interference on the line. Not with alarm, with attention. Understanding exactly what the signal was telling you and deciding what to do with the information. Then Prescott spoke. He was slower than Garrett and less polished, and he did not try to perform authority, which Marin had come to understand was entirely deliberate. He laid out the letters from Cheyenne first, 1879, 1881. Frank Calloway's voice in his own handwriting asking a territorial commissioner to confirm the designation of his notation system as personal intellectual property, years before any of the events in question, years before the name Devlin Marsh had entered the picture at all. He laid out Finch's declaration and let Willard read the relevant section without comment. He laid out Cora's testimony and Danny Henderson's witness account. He said at the end simply, "The documentation speaks, Your Honor. Miss Calloway's father spent 20 years making his intentions clear in writing. We ask the court to read what he wrote." Then Willard called Marin. She walked to the witness chair with the code book in her hands, and she sat down, and she looked at Willard, and she waited. Willard looked at the letters from Cheyenne, then at Marin. "Miss Calloway," he said, "tell me in your own words, not your lawyer's words, what this code book is." Marin looked at the code book in her hands. "This is the notation system my father developed over 22 years, she said. He developed it because the standard system failed in the conditions specific to Wyoming Territory. The electrical interference, the weather, the distances between relay stations. He tested it himself in bad weather at an open window transmitting through interference until he knew every sequence would hold when it needed to." She paused. "He documented every development in these pages because he was a man who believed that work worth doing was worth recording. And he designated it to me because I was the one who learned it from him, who worked beside him for 9 years, who can transmit and receive in his notation in conditions where no other operator in this territory can maintain a clean line." "He told you this directly," Willard said. "He told me when I was 12. He told me when I was 19. He told me the week before he died." She held Willard's gaze. "And he told the Territorial Communications Commissioner in writing in 1879, when I was 8 years old, because he was already thinking about what would happen to the work when he was gone." Willard looked at Garrett. "I want to address the medical declaration directly. Dr. Harlan's statement rests on 3 observations. Petitioner's wife demonstrated erratic behavior. Petitioner's wife departed the marital home without notice. Petitioner's wife removed materials from a shared residence without permission." He set the declaration down. "Counsel, I want to know the clinical basis for concluding that those behaviors constitute evidence of mental incompetency, rather than evidence of a person removing themselves and their property from a harmful situation." Garrett stood. He spoke for 2 minutes. He used the word erratic 4 times. He did not once cite a specific clinical standard. Willard looked at him for a moment after he finished. "Doctor, Finch's counter-declaration cites 4 specific clinical standards and applies them directly to his observations over 2 documented visits." He picked up Finch's declaration. Dr. Finch states that the behaviors demonstrated by Miss Calloway are consistent with the adaptive responses of a person managing ongoing physical harm and are inconsistent with any recognized standard of mental incompetency. He set it down. I am also noting for the record that Dr. Harlan's declaration does not include any record of a personal examination of Miss Calloway. It is based entirely on the petitioner's account of her behavior. The courtroom was very quiet. Garrett began to speak. Willard raised one hand. I've read the filings. I've heard the witness. I've read 22 years of documentation in a man's own handwriting. He looked at both tables. Is there anything else either party wishes this court to consider before I rule? Marin looked at the codebook in her hands. She thought about what she needed to say, and she said it plainly, the way her father had always said things without architecture around it. My father spent 19 years building something that worked, she said. Not just a business, a system, a way of sending information clearly through conditions that defeated every other method. He built it, carefully, tested it, honestly, documented it completely, and designated it to the person he had spent 9 years training to use it. She looked at Willard. That is not contested property. That is a man's life work passed in writing to his daughter, witnessed by a territorial commissioner, confirmed by a licensed physician, and carried here intact. She put the code book on the rail in front of her. It has never been anyone else's. It was always going to be mine. Willard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his papers. The court finds, he said, that the competency petition filed by Devlin Marsh does not meet the evidentiary standard required for a territorial court to suspend a legal inheritance designation. The medical declaration presented by the petitioner is unsupported by direct clinical examination and is contradicted by a counter-declaration citing specific clinical standards and documented prior observations. He picked up the letters from Cheyenne. Furthermore, the correspondence between the late Frank Calloway and the Territorial Communications Commissioner constitutes a public record establishing the personal intellectual property designation of the notation system described in these proceedings, predating the events in question by a period of 4 to 6 years. The petition is denied. The inheritance designation in the will of Frank Calloway stands without modification. The codebook and notation system described therein are the legal property of Marin Calloway. He set down his pen. This court also notes for the record that the medical declaration signed by Dr. Harlan has been formally contradicted by a more qualified and more thoroughly documented counter-declaration. I will be forwarding a copy of this ruling to the Territorial Medical Board for their information. He looked at Devlin's table for a moment. This matter is concluded. He stood. The courtroom stood. Marin sat for a moment longer. She looked at the codebook on the rail. She picked it up and held it the way she had held it for 9 years, the way her father had held it for 22, with the particular care of someone who understood what they were holding and why it mattered. She put it in the satchel. She stood. Prescott shook her hand and said something about the letters from Cheyenne that she heard and would remember later, but what she was registering at that moment was Devlin across the room closing his document case with the specific controlled movement of a man absorbing a loss he had not genuinely prepared for, because he had never genuinely prepared for the possibility that she would win. She watched him speak quietly to Garrett, and she watched Garrett's face, and she watched Devlin stand and walk out of the courtroom without looking at her, without looking at anything that was not the door in front of him. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph. The satisfaction of a structure that had been built to hold and had held when the full weight came on it. The particular completeness of a thing done correctly all the way through, no shortcuts, no gaps, no joints that failed under pressure. Holt was at the back of the courtroom. When she walked up the aisle toward him, she saw his face, which was doing the several things at once that it did when he was not regulating it, and she felt something move in her chest that she was done being careful about. Cy was beside him. Cy's expression was what it always was, settled and certain, the expression of a man who had believed in a specific outcome and was unsurprised to see it arrive. "Your father's daughter," C said. "Yes," she said. "I am." They walked out into the afternoon. The Wyoming light was strong and direct, and the street moved around them with the indifferent commerce of a town that had its own business to conduct. Marin stood on the courthouse steps with the satchel against her side and the codebook inside it, and breathed the cold, clean air of early spring. And then Holt was beside her close, but not touching, present in the way he was present, which required nothing from her, but accepted everything she chose to offer. "Ellie," he said, and then corrected himself immediately. "Marin." Something moved in his voice on the correction. "I need to say something, and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't know how to say it any other way, and I don't want to find one." She looked at him. "I know what kind of man I am," he said. "Not perfectly, not every corner of it, but enough that I can stand behind it. And I know what kind of woman you are. Someone who builds things that hold. Someone who knows her own mind and does not need anyone to make her choices for her." He paused. "I want to be clear that I understand that. I am not asking you to need me. I have no interest in being needed." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking if you want me, because that is a different question entirely, and the difference matters." Marin looked at him on those courthouse steps in the Wyoming afternoon, with the satchel in her hands, and her father's work inside it documented and designated and legally confirmed, and entirely hers. She thought about a man who had found her in the dark of his cattle wagon, and had not shouted, had not demanded, had simply sat down and waited for her to decide whether she could trust him. She thought about everything he had done since then, without once making it about what she owed him for it. She thought about 9 years of her father's voice saying the work doesn't belong to the person who started it. It belongs to the person who keeps it honest. And she thought about what it meant to choose a life the way her father had chosen his work, carefully, with full knowledge of what she was choosing and why. She thought about what her father had written to the territorial commissioner in 1879. She had been 8 years old. He had been thinking about what would last. "Holt Decker," she said. "Yes, I want you." He exhaled. The quiet exhale of a man who has held something carefully for a long time, and is now able to set it down without having broken it. He took her free hand in both of his, and they stood like that on the courthouse steps in Casper, Wyoming, in the spring of 1883, with Cy watching from a respectful distance, and the town moving past them with its customary indifference to the most important moments of other people's lives. They were married 2 weeks later, at the Saddleback Ridge Ranch on a Saturday morning, when the light came in flat and gold across the pasture and the horses moved in the corral with the easy rhythm of animals that had never needed to be anywhere else. Vera performed the ceremony herself, holding the territorial marriage authority she had obtained in 1871 and used exactly twice before, on occasions she described only as necessary. Cy stood as witness. Danny held the horses outside and attempted to look composed, and did not entirely succeed. Cora Tesler rode up from Laramie the evening before, and stayed the night because Marin had asked her, and because she had said yes before Marin had finished asking. Marin wore her father's codebook in its satchel across her body at the ceremony, because it was hers, and it went where she went, and she wanted it present in the record of that day, documented alongside everything else that was true about her. Holt looked at the satchel, and then at her face, and his expression was the one she had been watching learn itself for months, the expression of a man who saw exactly who she was, and had never once wanted anything less. The territorial communications license was renewed in Marin's name in March, exactly as Prescott had predicted. The Northern Pacific Junction assessment was completed in April, with Marin's notation system confirmed as the operational standard for the primary communication line. Devlin Marsh filed no further petitions. He left Laramie by summer and did not return, which was the most honest thing he had ever done. Cora Tesler continued to operate the Laramie station under Marin's license with a formal partnership agreement drawn up by Prescott that gave Cora an ownership stake and Marin the intellectual property rights, which was the arrangement that made sense, and the one both women had arrived at independently, before either had said it out loud. Maren Decker worked the telegraph line for the next 37 years. She trained 19 operators in her father's notation system. She corresponded with the Territorial Communications Commissioner 4 more times each letter, building on the record the previous one had established, each one laying another piece of the foundation her father had started in 1879. Her name went into the Territorial Communications records alongside his, not as a continuation of his work, but as the next chapter of it, because that was what he had always intended and what she had always understood. On the morning of their 20th wedding anniversary, Holt came into the ranch office and found her at the telegraph key running a notation sequence in the way she did when she was thinking, tapping 2 fingers in the rhythm her father had taught her. Holt stood in the doorway and looked at her with the same full attention he had given her every morning for 20 years, the attention of a man who had never once taken for granted what he had found in the dark of a cattle wagon on a Wyoming road before dawn. She looked up and saw his face and thought, as she had thought 1,000 mornings before it, that she had grown into everything her father had meant for her. The work and the life and the ground beneath her feet that was solid and confirmed and entirely her own. A frightened woman who had hidden in a stranger's cattle wagon with broken ribs and her father's code book pressed against her side had become this, a woman who stood on her own ground in her own name, with her own hands full of work she had chosen, and a life that was completely and permanently and undeniably hers. That is what it looks like when a woman refuses to be a variable. That is what it looks like when the work and the life and the love are all chosen freely and held without condition. That is what courage looks like when it finishes growing. Not loud, not dramatic, just present and permanent and built to last.